Hello everyone, Steven here from Adolescence with another fragrance review. And this time we have a fragrance from the house of Azzaro, and the fragrance is called Visit. So Visit by Azzaro. Now before I proceed with the review, I do want to disclaim that if you're a woman and you're watching this video, just bear in mind that this is not a unisex fragrance. There is a counterpart to this fragrance called Visit for women on the market. So if you get a chance, please check that one out. I think that one is a bit more peppery up on top, and it utilizes a few floral notes that constitute the heart or the mid of the fragrance. So it does have a counterpart, but this is also known as Visit for Men, or it also goes by that name, so bear that in mind. Now, Visit for Men by Azzaro was released in 2003, 6 years after the release of the heavy hitter and what is probably the bestseller from the house, without a doubt. That's Chrome for Men. Now, Chrome is a little powdery, it's a bit more on the aquatic citrus side. I think it does also have a hint of sweetness that's attributed to a pineapple note in the top of that fragrance. There's nothing sweet going on in Visit for Men. There's nothing sweet about this fragrance. So if you're looking for a gourmand, this is not the way to go. But if you want to learn a little bit more about this fragrance, please stay tuned. Now, this was released in 2003. The perfumer behind this fragrance is Annick Menardo. So right off the bat, you know that this is going to be a fragrance that takes a few creative risks, and namely those in the composition of the fragrance. Now, there are other risks that are taken about this fragrance, and I will tackle that a little later on in this review. But I think to release a fragrance on the designer branch of the fragrance industry that is as unique as this one was certainly a risk that was taken in the composition of this fragrance, because there's nothing generic about it. I do want to highlight that about this fragrance, is that there's nothing citrusy, there's nothing aquatic about this fragrance, although it does have a little bit of bergamot in the opening, which is not really expected from the Azzaro house, even with other releases like Twin and so on and so forth. Now, there is a flanker on the market called Bright Visit. That one, I do have to say, that's the best way to put it. It's brighter. It's a brighter composition. So if you're looking for something that's not as smoky, not as incensey, and not as resinous as this fragrance is, also a bit animalic too, definitely consider the flanker. Now, as far as that goes, if you go on Azzaro's website, this fragrance is not available anymore. Although I do believe some sources are saying that it's still in production, so bear that in mind. But if you do look on their website, you will see that the only one that's sold is actually the flanker. But I think that connotes that the original would still be in production as well if they're still selling the flanker. So the perfumer is Annick Menardo, and not only was a risk taken in the composition of the fragrance, but a risk was also taken in the marketing of the fragrance. And that is that it was conveying a sort of theme. The theme is, you picture a young man walking down the street with skyscrapers looming over his head, towering over him on either side of him, just big, tall buildings made out of concrete and glass, and he's walking down the streets of what I have to emphasize is an urban neighborhood, and his heart is beating in unison with the rhythm and the sounds of the surrounding atmosphere. Now, that sounds very nice. It's a fragrance that was put out made to be modern, contemporary, and the way that I perceive it is that it's made to appeal to the other age range than one that they were previously familiar with appealing to. What I mean by that is Chrome. If you've watched the advertisements or have seen the advertisements for Chrome, it's an older gentleman with what is probably his son. So Chrome is supposed to be more on the mature side, more catered toward the older crowd. This one is catered toward the younger crowd. And that's how I perceive it. Now, I do think that the risk in this theme is that when you're trying to embody the smell of an urban neighborhood, or a man walking and living in an urban neighborhood, it could be perceived as offensive, especially if the fragrance stinks. Now, I do have to say that you can not hold your breath anymore. This fragrance doesn't stink per se. It's not generic. It doesn't necessarily come across as very inoffensive. I do think that some qualities of this fragrance could come across as offensive, but it's certainly not a generic type of smell. And I think when you're talking about an urban neighborhood, that connotes a certain demographic of people. So there are some that would be attributed to an urban neighborhood, some that would be attributed to a suburban neighborhood. So I think this took more than one type of risk, and I think it fulfilled that risk in saying that it didn't come across as being offensive. So with that being said, let's move on to the presentation for Visit for Men by Azzaro. Here we have the presentation for Visit for Men by Azzaro. First up we have the box, and I do apologize for the condition of my box here at the bottom. You have the name of the house embossed in there. It looks very nice. Aside from that, nothing too fancy going on here. You do have a metallic finish that's pretty good at collecting fingerprints. You also have the name of the fragrance written here in the middle, the concentration down at the bottom, and the size, 100 milliliter or 3.4 ounces, the conversion. Nothing going on the sides of this box, but on the bottom of the back you do have the ingredients listed. And on the bottom of the box itself you have the UPC code, and the serial number is engraved here in the top left hand corner. Aside from that, nothing too much going on. I think the selling point or the highlight of this fragrance is the bottle. It's a very nice bottle. You have the name of the house embossed here at the bottom, and as you can tell by the border, this is actually a very thick glass, very durable, very sturdy. I would feel very comfortable traveling with this. There's a unique crescent shape going on in this bottle too. I'm not quite sure what that is supposed to represent, but it is a unique shape. With that being said, at the top here, I do want you to bear in mind that in the smaller sizes that this fragrance is available in, this is actually a cap that comes off. For the 3.4 ounce, there's a very unique triggering mechanism or apparatus where you just spray here, and as you can tell, the atomizer works particularly well. A very nice burst. And then you have Visit written on the right here in a frosted glass type of finish. But aside from that, that's pretty much it. And that was a presentation for Visit for Men by Azzaro. As far as the smell goes for Visit for Men by Azzaro, I'm just going to spray it on my hand to remind myself what it smells like. And I also love using the sprayer, so bonus points for that. Okay, so this fragrance opens up with just a very mild citrus. There is a citrus note in the opening of this fragrance, but I do have to say, and I must reiterate, that there is nothing sweet about this fragrance. So I have looked it up. It is bergamot. Now, there is a bit of bergamot in the opening. I would also be inclined to say that there might even be a little bit of lime in this opening. No tangerine, no mandarin orange, no sweet citrus notes, no pineapple, nothing like that. So you get a little bit of bergamot, but I think it doesn't really serve in giving this fragrance an invigorating opening, which is what I expected when I saw the bergamot paired up with ginger. So whenever you're thinking ginger and citrus notes, you're thinking of a revitalizing, refreshing, invigorating type of fragrance. You don't get that because they're not necessarily the star players. And I think that's because they don't come across as being very concentrated in this fragrance. Now there's also a little bit of cardamom in this fragrance as well, serving as a top note or a head note. Again, it's not very concentrated, so it doesn't really give the fragrance that sensual feel that cardamom does in other fragrances. The two notes in the opening of this fragrance that I do think are a bit more concentrated are the nutmeg and the pink pepper. There's certainly a lot of nutmeg in this fragrance. Fortunately, it doesn't give this fragrance a culinary vibe. It just contributes to that smokiness. And I do have to say that probably an ingredient that's even more concentrated than the ones that I've listed thus far is incense. And there's an incense note that's just so ever present in the opening, although it is constituted as a mid note or a heart note in this fragrance. So this fragrance, I think it's safe to say, it opens up with a blast of nutmeg and a blast of incense. Now it's woody as well, and I think there's a little bit of cedar wood working in the base of this fragrance. I did look it up, and there's also gaiac wood in there. Gaiac wood I don't have too much experience with, but it doesn't come across as evident or as strong as the cedar wood does, and cedar is very generic or very traditionally used in perfumery, and I'm very familiar with that smell, so I can safely say that there's a lot of cedar wood in this fragrance. So I think the most prominent ingredients are the incense that's used in the mid, the cedar that's used in the base, and the nutmeg comes across very clear in the opening as well. Again, the ginger and the cardamom don't really, they work hand in hand very well, but they are not so prominent as in the cardamom giving this fragrance a sensual vibe, or even the ginger giving it an invigorating type of vibe or a fresh feeling in this fragrance. It doesn't do that at all. But there is a pink pepper note that I think should not go unnoticed because it works in a very particular way in this fragrance. It's very evident in the opening. in the sense that it doesn't give it a spicy feel, maybe a very mild spiciness, but it's hard to determine whether that spiciness is coming from the ginger, the pink pepper berry, or the nutmeg in this fragrance. But the pink pepper is actually, like I said, a type of berry, and it gives a rosy feeling to this fragrance. It does have a rosy smell to it, and if I didn't notice it, or if you don't bear it in mind, it's kind of easy to overlook that. But once you do keep that in the back of your head and you smell it again, it's actually quite noticeable. But I do have to say that it doesn't come across too strong or too concentrated as a rose note or a type of floral wood in this fragrance. It's nothing like that. So there's nothing sweet and nothing floral about it, with the exception of that very mild, nuanced pink pepperberry in the opening. And then as you start to transition over into the mid, you are going to get a resinous feel as well. There's a little bit of labdanum in here. And not only is it giving this fragrance a very mild, unsweetened, resinous type of feel, I think it's working very well with the animalic base that this fragrance has. Because I would say probably 5 to 6 hours in the base of this fragrance, there's a musk note that comes out very clear in this fragrance. There's also a heavy dose of ambergris in this fragrance. Now, the ambergris, although it's not as concentrated as the other notes, I think it's perceivable much before the musk is. And I think that's saying a lot in terms of the composition of this fragrance. Now, I do have to say that it does smell synthetic. I do want to throw another little disclaimer out there. Ambergris is a very expensive ingredient. You're looking at about $1,000 for a single gram. So yes, I don't think they could afford to use real ambergris unless they want to spike up the prices like they would in a Creed fragrance. So in this case, it does come across smelling a bit synthetic. Nevertheless, it is a very animalic base. I can't really tell by smelling my hand right now because I'm still pretty well into the opening. I could still smell the bergamot in here, but it does have a very animalic base, so take my word for it. So it opens up spicy and citrusy. It transforms into a woody and resinous mid and a completely animalic base. So I think just to conclude with this, the two most concentrated ingredients in the composition of this fragrance are the incense and the cedar wood. The cedar wood is ever present in the opening, as is the nutmeg. And like I said, the other spices are kind of serving as a backbone to this fragrance. They're just giving it a bit of personality, not necessarily the star players, but a very animalic base. So with that being said, let's move on to the rating for Visit for Men by Azzaro. Now for the rating of Visit for Men by Azzaro. First up, we have overall smell, and I ended up giving Visit a 9 out of 10. A 9 out of 10 because it is a non-linear fragrance and there's a pretty cool scent development or a progression that you get on your skin. It opens up spicy and smoky. It transitions into a resinous mid with a few woodsy notes like guaiac wood and cedar wood constituting the heart of the fragrance, and then it dries down to a very animalic base. So I love the progression, and I'm constantly sniffing my hand just to see what part of the fragrance that I am in terms of its non-linearity. So very nice smell, and I had a hard time comparing this to many other fragrances in my collection. I really couldn't, just because there's nothing floral about it, there's nothing sweet about it, there's nothing gourmand or confectionery about it, so it really does stand out, and I think it was a pretty creative risk, a pretty big creative risk taken, considering that this is a designer fragrance, and most designer fragrances are made to appeal to a wide variety of people, made to be universally appealing, made to be a little more on the generic side, and this is one that doesn't really smell too synthetic with the exception of the ambergris in the base, so a 9 out of 10 for overall smell and uniqueness. Next up, we have longevity, and I got above average longevity from this fragrance, which actually surprised me considering that this is an eau de toilette concentration. Fortunately, however, most of the ingredients in the composition of this fragrance are not very volatile. We're talking about smoky ingredients, spicy ingredients, woody notes, animalic notes, resinous notes, gray amber, labdanum. Those aren't really volatile, so you are getting a fantastic longevity out of this fragrance. And I washed my hands 4 times today, and I washed the dishes, and I've been wearing this for 9 to 10 hours and it's still going strong, so I give this one a 9 out of 10 for longevity. Next up, we have projection, and unfortunately this one really suffers in this department. It does not project very well. I would actually say it projects far below an arm's length and only for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Unfortunately, the only time it does project is when the citrus note in the opening and the spices in the opening are still evident. Once they evaporate, the projection of this fragrance is compromised. And again, what is a fragrance if it lasts a very long time but it doesn't project? So unfortunately, I gave it a 4 out of 10 for projection. Next up, we have versatility. I gave it a 4 out of 10 for versatility as well. It suffers in this department as well, or it lacks in this department mainly because there are many social contexts that you cannot wear this one in. You can't wear it in a semi-formal setting, and you can't wear it in a formal setting. I think that there are many other fragrances in one's collection that one could reach for over this fragrance. So unfortunately, you could wear it casually. I could see this being more of a fragrance to wear in the comfort of your own home, but you could wear this one casually. And of course, this is geared more toward the colder weather, be it with the woody notes and the incense and the smoky characteristics of this fragrance. So more for the colder weather and maybe a cold fall day, but to be worn more in the nighttime than in the daytime. And it is not a unisex fragrance, more towards the men's side. Now, I know this does come across as a bit counterproductive, being that I said you could wear it casually, but is to be worn more at nighttime, and that's just because I can't picture myself doing too many casual things at night. So unfortunately, it does suffer in the versatility department of this fragrance, so I gave it a 4 out of 10. And then last up, we have presentation. I ended up giving Visit for Men a 7 out of 10 for the presentation, mainly because, yes, it does have a cool little sprayer on it that triggers the atomizer, and I think the box looks very nice, but I couldn't give it a perfect score or even a very high score for presentation, mainly because of the creative risks that were taken in terms of the advertising and the marketing campaign for this fragrance. I think that there were a few risks taken in offending a particular demographic of people or people that live in an urban neighborhood. And I do have to say that those risks were positively identified in the sense that not too many people got offended. And I think that the fact that this fragrance is still in production speaks volumes in terms of whether people got offended by it or not. And I think that it's the latter. People didn't really get offended. So a 7 out of 10 for presentation. And that brings this fragrance to an overall or an average score of 6.6 out of 10. So there you have it. That was my review of Visit for Men by Azzaro. As always, please don't forget to comment, rate, and subscribe to my channel. It would be greatly appreciated. This has been Stephen with another fragrance review from Adolescence. Thanks for watching.